Chapter 11. Ivy woke up to the smell of coffee and the unnerving realization that she wasn't in her own bed. The sheets were too soft, the room too fancy, and there definitely wasn't a water-stained ceiling looming above her. She sat up, blinking at the sunlight pouring through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Adrian's penthouse. The events of the night before came rushing back. The auction, the kiss, the intensity in Adrian's eyes. "Oh no," she groaned, flopping back against the pillows. Her moment of pity was interrupted by a knock at the door. "Good morning," Evelyn said, walking in like she owned the place, a tablet balanced in one hand and a steaming mug of coffee in the other. "How's our new resident?" "Confused," Ivy replied, sitting up again. "And mildly terrified," Ivy replied, smirked. "That's normal. Drink this." She handed Ivy the coffee which, thankfully, tasted like heaven in a cup. "Adrian wants you in the training room in 10 minutes. "Training room?" Ivy frowned. "What am I training for? A ninja competition?" "You'll see," Evelyn said cryptically before sauntering out. The training room turned out to be a massive open space with sleek floors, mirrored walls, and a vibe that screamed expensive fitness studio. Adrian stood in the center, wearing a perfectly tailored black shirt and exuding his usual aura of I'm in chargeness. "You're late," he said as Ivy stepped in. "By 30 seconds, she muttered, crossing her arms. Adrian raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. Instead, he gestured for her to join him. "Today, you'll learn the first rule of surviving in my world. Composure." "Composure?" Ivy asked, already suspicious. "Yes. You'll learn to remain calm, no matter the situation," Adrian explained, his voice cool and measured. "That sounds vague," she said. Adrian's lips twitched, almost a smile. "It won't be for long. Come here." Lesson 1. Composure, or lack thereof. Adrian stood behind Ivy, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. "Relax," he said. "Relax," she repeated, her voice a pitch higher than usual. "You're literally standing over me like a vampire about to strike, and you want me to relax?" Adrian ignored her, gently adjusting her posture. "Straighten your back, chin up, look confident." "I'm trying," she said through gritted teeth. "You're failing," he replied calmly. Ivy turned to glare at him, but Adrian's hands moved to her waist, steadying her. The touch was light, almost casual, but it sent a shiver up her spine. "Focus," he said, his voice lower now. "Composure is about control of your body, your mind, and your reactions. If you can't master that, you'll be vulnerable." Ivy tried to focus, but all she could think about was how close he was. His breath tickled the back of her neck, and his hands lingered just a second too long. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, her voice wavering. "More than you realize," Adrian murmured. As the session continued, Ivy found herself oddly intrigued by Adrian's methods. His instructions were firm but not unkind, and there was something undeniably magnetic about the way he moved, the way he spoke. At one point he stood in front of her, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "Imagine someone is watching you, waiting for you to break. Can you handle that?" Ivy swallowed hard. "Think?" Adrian stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You don't think, you know." Ivy held his gaze, her walls cracking just a little. There was something in his eyes. Intensity, yes, but also curiosity, like he was as fascinated by her as she was by him. By the end of the session, Ivy was exhausted but strangely exhilarated. As much as she hated to admit it, Adrian's world was starting to draw her in. "Not bad," Adrian said as she caught her breath. "Thanks, I guess," Ivy muttered. Adrian stepped closer, his hand brushing against hers as he tilted her chin up. His eyes burned with something she couldn't quite name. "This is only the beginning," he said, his voice a low growl. "You'll either learn or be broken trying." Ivy stared at him, her heart pounding. She didn't know what scared her more, failing his expectations or the part of her that wanted to meet them. Chapter 12. Ivy tried not to gawk, but Adrian's club was impossible to ignore. The building loomed over the city like a glass and steel crown, radiating exclusivity and power. The moment they stepped inside, she was hit with a wave of cool air that smelled like money and expensive cologne. "Welcome to Echelon," Adrian said as they entered the grand lobby. His voice was calm, but there was a note of pride in it. Ivy glanced around, her eyes catching on the sleek marble floors, the golden accents that shimmered under crystal chandeliers, and the impeccably dressed people who seemed to glide instead of walk. "Yeah, this doesn't scream normal," Adrian smirked. "Normal isn't what I aim for." A woman in a crimson dress walked by, glancing at Adrian with a smile that could melt steel. Ivy couldn't help but notice how his presence commanded attention. Even in a room full of powerful people, Adrian was the sun, and everyone else was a planet orbiting him. "Try to keep up," he said, placing a hand on her lower back. "I'll do my best," Ivy muttered, resisting the urge to duck behind him. The players step in. They entered a private lounge on the top floor where the atmosphere was even more intimidating. Plush leather chairs, soft lighting, and a view of the city that made Ivy's stomach flip. A few people were scattered around, sipping drinks and speaking in low voices. Evelyn was the first to approach, her tablet conspicuously absent for once. "You clean up well," she said to Ivy, her smile surprisingly genuine. "Thanks," Ivy said, tugging at the hem of her dress. "Still feels like I'm playing dress-up." "Trust me, you'll get used to it," Evelyn replied. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Just don't let anyone here see you sweat. Confidence is currency in this room." "Great," Ivy said. "I'm broke in every sense of the word," Evelyn chuckled. "Stick close to Adrian, you'll survive. Enter Alexander Cross." Just as Ivy was starting to feel a tiny bit less like a fish out of water, a man strode into the lounge with an air that screamed trouble. He was tall and handsome, with a sharp smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Adrian," the man drawled, his voice smooth as silk. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight." Adrian's expression cooled by a few degrees. "Alexander." Alexander's eyes slid to Ivy, and his smile widened. "And who's this?" "Ivy," Adrian said, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "She's with me." "Is she now?" Alexander took a step closer, his gaze lingering on Ivy in a way that made her skin crawl. "You have good taste, I'll give you that." Ivy shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Adrian. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched at his sides. "Enough," Adrian said, his voice low and dangerous, but Alexander wasn't done. He leaned closer to Ivy, his smile turning into a smirk. "Be careful, darling. Adrian doesn't play well with others. You might find yourself in over your head." Ivy opened her mouth to respond, but Adrian was faster. He stepped between them, his presence towering and unmistakably protective. "If you're finished," Adrian said, his tone icy, "you can leave." "Always so serious. Lighten up, Vale." He winked at Ivy before walking away, leaving a trail of tension in his wake. A moment alone. The rest of the evening was a blur. Adrian introduced Ivy to a few key players, investors, allies, and people who radiated the same level of power he did. But her mind kept circling back to Alexander's words, and the look in Adrian's eyes. By the time they returned to the penthouse, Ivy was ready to collapse. She kicked off her heels and headed for the couch, but Adrian caught her arm, spinning her to face him. "Never let anyone think you're free to take," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Ivy blinked up at him, startled by the intensity in his gaze. "What are you talking about?" "Alexander," Adrian said, his tone sharp. "He crossed a line. I won't tolerate it." "You didn't encourage him," Ivy protested. "I know," Adrian said, his hand moving to cup her chin. "But I need you to understand something, Ivy." His grip was firm but not harsh, and his eyes burned with a mix of anger and something deeper, something that sent a shiver down her spine. "You belong to me," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Don't forget it." Ivy's breath caught as Adrian's words settled over her. She didn't know whether to pull away or lean closer. But one thing was clear. Her life was no longer her own. Chapter 13. For the first time since her new life began, Ivy was given an evening to herself. No rules, no Adrian's piercing stares, no unnerving guests to impress. just peace and quiet in the enormous penthouse library, which was honestly way too fancy for someone who hadn't finished reading a book since high school. She trailed her fingers along the rows of perfectly arranged books, pausing at titles she'd never heard of. Most looked like they hadn't been touched in years, except for a small section of well-worn spines. She pulled one out and smiled. It was a collection of poems, with faint creases on the pages. "Who knew the big bad wolf had a soft side?" she muttered, flipping through it. But her attention was quickly drawn to something else, a framed photograph sitting on the edge of a nearby desk. Unlike the rest of the room, which screamed, "Don't touch," this photo felt oddly out of place. Curiosity got the better of her. Ivy picked up the frame, tilting it toward the light. It was a picture of a boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing next to a woman with kind eyes and a soft smile. The boy looked familiar. Those sharp blue eyes and serious expression were unmistakable. "Adrian," she whispered. The woman had to be his mother. There was a warmth in the photo Ivy had never seen in Adrian's face, a glimpse of a life that felt worlds away from the one he lived now. "Find something interesting?" Ivy jumped, nearly dropping the frame. She spun around to see Adrian leaning against the doorway, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. "Oh, sorry," she stammered, holding up the photo like a guilty kid caught sneaking cookies. "It was just sitting there and Relax," Adrian said, walking toward her. "I left it there on purpose." "You did?" Ivy asked, narrowing her eyes. "To see if you'd look," he replied, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Her cheeks burned. "Oh, well, congrats, I failed your test." Adrian took the frame from her, his smirk fading as he studied the photo. "That's my mother," he said quietly. Ivy blinked. She hadn't expected him to actually answer. "She's beautiful," she said softly. "She was," Adrian replied, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "She died when I was 9. Ivy's heart sank. The way he said it, matter of fact, with no trace of emotion, felt heavier than if he'd cried. "I'm sorry," she said, unsure what else to say. Adrian set the photo back on the desk, his fingers lingering on the frame. "She was the only person who ever made me feel human." The words hung in the air, raw and unexpected. For the first time, Adrian Vale wasn't the untouchable, brooding man who controlled everything in his orbit. He was just Adrian. "She sounds amazing," Ivy said, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian's gaze shifted to her, his blue eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. "She was. She taught me to love books, to think before I acted, to believe there was good in the world." "What happened?" Ivy asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Adrian hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Life happened. People showed me that good doesn't always win." The bitterness in his voice made Ivy's chest ache. "Maybe it doesn't," she said cautiously. "But that doesn't mean it's not worth trying for." For a long moment, Adrian didn't respond. He simply looked at her, as if trying to decide whether or not he believed her. "You're different," he said finally, taking a step closer. "Different how?" Ivy asked, her pulse quickening. Adrian tilted his head, his gaze flicking to her lips. "You see things I've forgotten how to see. It's infuriating and dangerous." "Dangerous?" she repeated, frowning. He leaned in, close enough that she could feel his breath on her skin. "You're more dangerous than you realize, little one." Ivy's breath caught, her heart thundering in her chest. His words weren't a threat. They were something else entirely, something that made her stomach twist in ways she didn't understand. As Adrian straightened and walked away, Ivy stood frozen, her mind spinning. She didn't know what scared her more, the idea that Adrian was right, or the fact that a part of her wanted to prove him wrong. Chapter 14. Ivy tugged at the hem of her dress, glaring at Adrian through the reflection of the penthouse's enormous mirror. "Do I really have to go to this thing?" "Yes," Adrian replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Why?" she asked, turning to face him. "Can't you just, I don't know, bring someone who actually knows how to impress people?" Adrian stepped closer, his sharp suit making him look even more intimidating. "You'll do fine," he said, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "And you need the practice." "Practice for what?" Ivy shot back, crossing her arms. "For living in my world," Adrian said simply, brushing an invisible speck off his sleeve. "Now stop stalling. We're leaving." The venue was breathtaking. Grand chandeliers, sparkling glasses of champagne, and a string quartet playing in the background. Ivy felt like she'd stumbled into the set of a period drama, except instead of corsets, everyone was decked out in designer gowns and perfectly tailored tuxedos. She clung to Adrian's side as they entered, her pulse racing. People turned to look at them, at him, really. But Ivy couldn't shake the feeling that their gazes lingered on her, silently judging. "Relax," Adrian murmured, his hand settling lightly on the small of her back. "They're curious, not cruel. Yet comforting," Ivy muttered under her breath. Adrian led her to a cluster of his business partners, introducing her with a calm confidence that made her feel like she belonged, until she had to speak. "So, Ivy," one of the men said, raising an eyebrow, "how do you and Adrian know each other?" Her brain froze. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Adrian stepped in smoothly. "She's my companion," he said, his tone cool and final. The word hung in the air, sparking a few raised eyebrows, but no further questions. Still, Ivy couldn't help but feel like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. As the evening went on, Ivy started to find her rhythm. Under Adrian's subtle guidance, a light touch on her arm, a quiet word in her ear, she managed to charm the guests with her genuine, albeit slightly awkward, demeanor. "You're doing well," Adrian said during a brief lull, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Thanks," she whispered back, a small smile tugging at her lips. For a moment, she felt a flicker of pride. Maybe she wasn't as out of place here as she thought. That confidence shattered when a woman in a shimmering gold gown approached them. Her hair was perfectly styled, her smile razor-sharp. "Adrian," she purred, her voice dripping with faux warmth. "And this must be your project." Ivy's stomach twisted. "She's lovely," the woman continued, her gaze sweeping over Ivy like she was appraising a piece of furniture. "Though I can't help but wonder if you've lowered your standards." The words hit like a slap, and Ivy's cheeks burned. She opened her mouth to respond, but Adrian was faster. He stepped in front of her, his posture rigid, his voice cold. "Careful, Clara," he said, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "I'd hate for you to embarrass yourself." Clara blinked, clearly caught off guard, but Adrian didn't stop. "Ivy is with me," he continued, his voice louder now, drawing the attention of nearby guests. "And anyone who disrespects her disrespects me." The room fell silent. Clara's lips tightened, and she quickly excused herself, disappearing into the crowd. Ivy stared at Adrian, her heart pounding. The way he'd defended her, it was possessive, intense, and undeniably effective. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Yes, I did," Adrian replied, his eyes locking onto hers. "No one insults what's mine." The ride back to the penthouse was silent, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Ivy replayed the evening in her mind, torn between gratitude and frustration. When they arrived, Adrian escorted her inside, his hand lingering on her back. She turned to face him, her emotions boiling over. "Why do you keep doing that?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Acting like you own me?" Adrian stepped closer, his eyes darkening. "Because I do." "That's not how this works," Ivy said, her voice rising. "I'm not just—" Her words were cut off as Adrian cupped her face, his lips crashing against hers. The kiss was fierce, demanding, and utterly overwhelming. Ivy's mind screamed at her to pull away, but her body betrayed her, leaning into him instead. When he finally pulled back, her breath came in short gasps, her heart racing. "You can run from me, Ivy," Adrian said, his voice rough and filled with promise. "But you'll never escape this." Ivy stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind of confusion and desire. She didn't know whether to push him away or pull him closer, and that terrified her more than anything else. Chapter 15. Ivy paced the length of the penthouse, her thoughts running in circles. Every time she replayed the kiss in her mind, her stomach flipped. She hated that it made her feel things. Adrian Vale was the last person she should have feelings for. He was controlling, arrogant, and infuriatingly sure of himself. And yet, when he kissed her, all her carefully built defenses crumbled like sand castles in a storm. "This is insane," she muttered to herself, throwing herself onto the couch. A soft knock on the door interrupted her spiral. Evelyn stepped inside, looking as poised as ever. "Adrian needs you to join him at tonight's meeting," she said. Ivy sat up, frowning. "What meeting?" "It's with some of his key investors. It's important," Evelyn replied, tilting her head. "You should probably start getting ready." Ivy crossed her arms. "No," Evelyn blinked. "No?" "That's right," Ivy said, standing up. "I'm not going. I'm not a prop he can parade around whenever it's convenient." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "You do realize saying no to Adrian isn't exactly wise." "Then let him be mad," Ivy said, her jaw tightening. An hour later, Adrian stormed into the penthouse, his presence filling the room like a thundercloud. "Ivy," he said, his voice dangerously calm. She turned to face him, her heart pounding but her expression steady. "Let me guess. You're here to lecture me." Adrian's eyes narrowed. "Why weren't you at the meeting?" "Because I didn't want to go," she said, crossing her arms. His lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not how this works." "Oh, I know exactly how this works," Ivy shot back. "I'm supposed to follow your orders without question, right? Like a good little puppet." Adrian took a step closer, his gaze sharp enough to cut steel. "You signed a contract, Ivy. You agreed to my terms." "I agreed to save my family," she snapped, "not to lose myself in the process." Their argument escalated, the air between them crackling with tension. Adrian's usually calm demeanor slipped, revealing the raw intensity beneath. "You think you can defy me and get away with it?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I think I'm not afraid of you," Ivy replied, meeting his gaze head-on. Adrian stepped closer, his towering presence sending a shiver down her spine. "You should be. And you're used to people falling in line?" Ivy said, her voice trembling with both fear and defiance. "I'm not one of them, Adrian." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension was suffocating, their emotions clashing in a battle neither was willing to lose. Then Adrian's expression shifted. Instead of anger, his lips curved into a slow, deliberate smirk. "You're stronger than I thought," he said, his voice softer now but no less intense. Ivy's heart raced as he leaned in, his breath brushing against her ear. "Let's see how far you can go," he whispered. Ivy stared at him, her resolve unshaken. For the first time, she felt like she'd won a small victory. But the fire in Adrian's eyes promised that the real battle was only beginning. Chapter 16. The car ride to the negotiation was quieter than usual. Adrian sat next to Ivy, scrolling through his phone, exuding his usual air of unshakable confidence. Ivy, on the other hand, was trying to figure out why he'd even brought her along. "Are you going to tell me what this meeting is about?" she finally asked, glancing at him. "It's with Marcus Dane, one of my most valuable investors," Adrian replied without looking up. "Sounds fun," Ivy said sarcastically. "Why am I here?" Adrian finally met her gaze, his blue eyes sharp and assessing. "To listen, observe, and learn." "In other words, stay quiet," Ivy muttered under her breath. The meeting was held in a private room of an exclusive restaurant that looked like it charged extra for breathing their air. Marcus Dane was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a booming laugh and a handshake that felt like a vice grip. "Adrian," Marcus said, clapping him on the back. "And who's this lovely young lady?" "Ivy Whittaker," Adrian said smoothly. "She's with me." Marcus gave Ivy a quick once-over, then gestured for them to sit. Ivy took her place beside Adrian, trying to blend into the background as the negotiation began. The conversation was a whirlwind of terms, numbers, and deals Ivy didn't fully understand. She tried to keep up, her mind racing as Adrian and Marcus volleyed back and forth. Then Marcus said something that made her ears perk up. That's the thing, Adrian, Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. Your proposal is solid, but it lacks creativity. Where's the innovation? Adrian didn't flinch, but Ivy could see the slight tension in his jaw. Before she could stop herself, Ivy blurted out, "What if you position it as a sustainability initiative?" The room went silent. Adrian turned to her, his expression unreadable, while Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Sustainability initiative?" Marcus repeated. Ivy swallowed hard, her palms sweating. "Yeah, everyone's talking about green practices these days. If you frame the proposal as a way to improve environmental impact, it might stand out more. Plus, it's good PR." Marcus stared at her for a moment, then let out a booming laugh. "I like her," he said, pointing a finger at Adrian. "You've got a sharp one here." Adrian's lips curved into the faintest of smirks. She has her moments. By the end of the meeting, the deal was sealed. Marcus left with a grin, promising to finalize the paperwork within the week. Ivy felt a rush of relief and pride as she followed Adrian out of the restaurant. In the car, the silence was heavy with unspoken tension. Ivy fidgeted, wondering if Adrian was mad that she'd spoken out. "Where did that come from?" he asked finally, his tone neutral. I don't know," she admitted. "I just thought it might help." Adrian glanced at her, his blue eyes gleaming with something she couldn't quite place. "It did." "Wait, was that a compliment?" Ivy teased, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Don't get used to it," Adrian said, though there was a hint of amusement in his voice. Later that night, Ivy found herself in the penthouse library, staring out at the city lights. She was still replaying the meeting in her mind when Adrian walked in, carrying 2 glasses of wine. He handed one to her, his movements deliberate. "You impress me today," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Did I?" Ivy asked, surprised. Adrian nodded, his gaze intense. "Most people in that room wouldn't have dared speak up, but you did, and you were right." Ivy felt her cheeks heat up. "Thanks," she said, taking a sip of the wine. Adrian stepped closer, his presence commanding as always. "You keep surprising me," he said, his voice low and smooth. He tilted his head, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Let's see what else you're capable of." Ivy's heart raced as Adrian's words lingered in the air, promising challenges she wasn't sure she was ready for, but couldn't wait to face. Chapter 17. The charity gala was, as Ivy put it, ridiculously over the top. The venue was draped in shimmering lights. The tables were decked out with enough crystal and silverware to blind someone, and the guests all looked like they'd just stepped off the cover of a magazine. Ivy adjusted the hem of her gown for the 100th time, trying not to feel completely out of place. Why does everyone look like they have no problems? Is it a rich people superpower? Adrian, standing beside her with his usual air of authority, smirked. "They have problems. They're just better at hiding them." "Well, I don't have that skill," Ivy muttered, glancing nervously at the crowd. Adrian's hand rested lightly on her back, guiding her toward a circle of well-dressed guests. "You'll learn," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Ivy had just managed to snag a flute of champagne and find a quiet corner when a familiar voice sent a chill down her spine. "Miss Whitaker," Alexander cross-drawled, appearing at her side like a bad memory. Ivy tensed, her grip tightening on her glass. "Alexander," she said cautiously, keeping her tone neutral. He leaned casually against the wall, his sharp smile twisting her stomach. "I must say, Adrian has interesting taste, first in his business deals and now in his companions." Ivy bristled. "If you're here to insult me, get in line." Alexander laughed, a low, condescending sound. "Relax, darling, I'm just curious. Has Adrian told you about his past?" She frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Ah," Alexander said, his grin widening. "So he hasn't." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Did he mention the deal he made years ago? The one that could destroy everything if it came to light?" Ivy's heart skipped a beat. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't," Alexander said, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. "Adrian's very good at keeping secrets. But you should ask yourself, Ivy, what else is he hiding from you?" Before she could respond, He placed a hand lightly on her arm. "You're in deeper than you think, my dear. Be careful. Let go of her." The icy voice cut through the noise of the gala like a knife. Ivy turned to see Adrian approaching, his expression carved from stone. Alexander straightened, releasing Ivy's arm with a smirk. "Adrian, always a pleasure." Adrian didn't take his eyes off Alexander. "What are you doing here?" "Enjoying the party," Alexander said smoothly. "And having a little chat with your charming companion?" Adrian stepped closer, his presence radiating barely contained fury. "Stay out of my affairs, Alexander. Touchy, aren't we?" Alexander chuckled, brushing imaginary lint off his sleeve. "Fine, I'll leave, for now." He glanced at Ivy one last time. "Take care, Miss Whitaker." As Alexander disappeared into the crowd, Adrian turned to Ivy, his jaw tight. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said quickly, though her heart was still racing. Adrian's gaze softened for a brief moment, but the tension in his shoulders remained. "Let's go." Back in the car, the silence was thick. Ivy could feel Adrian's anger simmering beneath the surface, but she wasn't sure if it was directed at Alexander or her. Finally, she broke the silence. "What was Alexander talking about, the deal he mentioned?" Adrian's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "It doesn't matter." "It does to me," Ivy said, her voice rising slightly. "If I'm supposed to trust you, I need to know what's going on." Adrian pulled the car to a stop in front of the penthouse, turning to face her. His blue eyes were colder than she'd ever seen them. "You don't need to know everything, Ivy." She opened her mouth to argue, but he leaned closer, his grip firm on her arm. "Trust me, or don't," he said, his voice low and rough. "But remember who owns you." Ivy stared at him, torn between fear, frustration, and something she couldn't quite name. For the first time, she wondered if Adrian's secrets might be more dangerous than anything Alexander could throw at them. Chapter 18. Ivy didn't mean to eavesdrop. She'd just been passing through Adrian's sleek, intimidating office on her way to the kitchen when she heard the voices. They were muffled, barely audible through the heavy oak door, but something about the tension in them made her pause. "Cross doesn't need to know," said an unfamiliar voice, sharp with panic. "He already does," Adrian replied, his tone calm but laced with steel. The muffled conversation continued, but Ivy couldn't make out the rest. Her curiosity burned as she pressed her ear closer. Suddenly, the door creaked open. She jumped back, her heart racing, just in time to see a man she didn't recognize step out. He froze when he saw her, his face pale and his eyes wide. "You're not supposed to be here," he hissed, shoving past her. "Excuse me?" Ivy said, more out of reflex than confidence, but the man didn't stop, disappearing down the hall as if the devil himself were chasing him. Ivy wandered into the office, still shaken. Adrian stood by his desk, his shoulders tense. "What just happened?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Nothing you need to worry about," Adrian replied without looking at her. "That's funny," she said, sarcasm creeping into her tone, "because the guy who just stormed out of here looked like he'd seen a ghost." Adrian sighed, finally turning to face her. "Ivy, drop it." "No," she said, surprising even herself with the firmness in her voice. "What's going on?" Adrian stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight. "If you must know, I suspect there's a spy in my organization. Someone feeding information to Alexander." Ivy's stomach dropped. "A spy? That's serious, which is why I need to handle it," Adrian said, his tone clipped. Ivy nodded, unsure what else to say. But later that day, as she walked through the penthouse, she spotted the same man rifling through a drawer in the library. "What are you doing?" Ivy demanded, stepping into the room. The man froze, his hand hovering over a stack of papers. "Nothing," he said quickly, slamming the drawer shut, but Ivy wasn't convinced. "You're the spy," she blurted out, her pulse racing. The man's eyes narrowed. "You don't know what you're talking about." Before Ivy could respond, Adrian's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Actually, she does." They both turned to see Adrian standing in the doorway, his expression colder than Ivy had ever seen it. The room felt suffocating as Adrian walked toward the man, his steps deliberate and unhurried. "I trusted you," he said, his voice calm but deadly, "and you betrayed me." The man stammered, backing up until he hit the wall. I didn't have a choice. Cross. He threatened my family. Adrian tilted his head, his gaze unflinching. And you thought betraying me was the safer option? The man's silence spoke volumes. Adrian stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. If you ever breathe a word of this to anyone, I'll make sure Alexander regrets using you. Do you understand? The man nodded frantically, his face pale. Good, Adrian said, his voice soft but chilling. Now get out. The man bolted, leaving Ivy alone with Adrian. Ivy stared at Adrian, her heart pounding. She'd seen him angry before, but this was different. This was calculated, cold, and terrifyingly effective. You didn't have to scare him like that, she said, her voice trembling. Adrian turned to her, his expression unreadable. Yes, I did. No, you didn't, she insisted. You could have handled that without reminding him who he's dealing with. Adrian interrupted, his tone sharp. Ivy, in my world, weakness is a death sentence. If I let him think I'd forgive this, it wouldn't stop with him. That's intense, Ivy said, trying to process what she'd just witnessed. Adrian stepped closer, his hand reaching up to cup her face. His touch was surprisingly gentle, but his eyes burned with intensity. In my world, he said softly, weakness gets you killed. Don't forget that. Ivy shivered, torn between fascination and fear. Adrian's world was darker than she'd ever imagined, and she was no longer sure she wanted to know just how far it went. Chapter 19. Ivy stormed into Adrian's office, her heart still racing from what she'd witnessed. She didn't knock, didn't wait for an invitation. She just pushed the door open, her anger propelling her forward. Adrian sat behind his sleek black desk, his focus on the papers in front of him. He didn't even glance up. Ivy, he said, his voice calm but firm. I'm busy. Too bad, she shot back, slamming the door behind her. We need to talk. Adrian finally looked up, his blue eyes narrowing. I hope you're not here to question how I run things. That's exactly what I'm here for, Ivy snapped. What you did back there was cold, heartless. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his expression darkening. And what would you have done, Ivy? Given him a stern talking to? Told him to promise not to do it again? At least I wouldn't have terrified him into thinking you'd destroy his life, she retorted, crossing her arms. Then you don't understand what it takes to survive, Adrian said, standing. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. You think you can judge me? Adrian asked, his voice low and dangerous. You, who has no idea what it's like to build something from nothing, to have everything you've worked for constantly under threat? I understand more than you think, Ivy replied, her voice trembling but strong. But there's a difference between being strong and being cruel. Adrian's jaw tightened. Cruelty is a luxury I can't afford. Every decision I make is calculated. It has to be. You're so busy controlling everything, Ivy said, her anger softening into something closer to sorrow. You don't see what it's costing you. Adrian's eyes flickered, a shadow passing through them. And what exactly is it costing me? Your humanity, she said quietly. For a moment, silence filled the room. Adrian's fists clenched at his sides, his breath coming in shallow bursts. Ivy, he said finally, his voice softer now. You don't know what it's like to live in my world, the things I've done to survive, to protect what's mine. You'd never understand. Then explain it to me, she said, stepping closer. Help me understand, Adrian, because right now all I see is a man who's so afraid of losing control that he's lost himself. Her words hit something deep. Adrian's mask cracked, just enough for her to see the pain he usually kept hidden. He reached for her, his hands gripping her shoulders. You think this is easy for me, he said, his voice rough. You think I enjoy being this way? I have no choice, Ivy. There's always a choice, she whispered, her heart aching for him. Their gazes locked, the air between them thick with tension. Adrian's hand moved to her cheek, his touch both tender and possessive. Ivy, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Before she could respond, his lips crashed against hers, fierce and unrelenting. Ivy's mind screamed at her to pull away, but her body betrayed her, melting into him instead. Adrian's arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against him. His control, usually so absolute, seemed to shatter as he kissed her like she was the only thing keeping him grounded. They stumbled back toward the desk, their movements frantic, desperate. Adrian lifted her onto the smooth surface, his hands roaming as if trying to memorize every inch of her. Ivy's fingers tangled in his hair, her own need mirroring his. For a moment nothing else existed. No arguments, no secrets, no shadows of his past, just them. When they finally broke apart, their breaths ragged, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. His hands cupped her face, his touch uncharacteristically gentle. "You're mine, Ivy," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "But it's your choice whether to stay or run." Her heart pounded as his words sank in, their weight impossible to ignore. Adrian's gaze bore into hers, his tone soft but firm. "Make it wisely." Ivy stared at him, torn between the fear of what she'd seen and the pull of what she'd felt. One thing was clear. Whatever choice she made, there would be no turning back. Chapter 20. Ivy sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the skyline outside the penthouse window. The city lights twinkled, oblivious to the storm raging in her chest. Adrian's words from the night before echoed in her mind. "You're mine, Ivy, but it's your choice whether to stay or run." For the first time since entering Adrian's world, she felt like the decision was truly hers. She could walk away, return to her old life of uncertainty and struggle, or she could stay and try to understand this complex, infuriating man who had somehow managed to burrow his way under her skin. With a deep breath, Ivy stood. She wasn't the same person who had walked into Club Vesper all those weeks ago. She wasn't weak, and she wasn't running. She found Adrian in the library, his back to her as he scanned the rows of books. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, his sharp blue eyes narrowing slightly. "I made my decision," Ivy said, standing straighter than she felt. Adrian raised an eyebrow. "And I'm staying," she said firmly, "but not because I'm yours. I'm staying because I want to be." For a moment, Adrian just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then his lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "Good," he said simply, his tone soft but laced with satisfaction. The days that followed felt different. The tension between them didn't disappear. It morphed into something warmer, more electric. Adrian still exuded control, but there were cracks in his armor, moments where his touch lingered or his voice softened. One evening, as they sat on the couch in the dimly lit living room, Ivy noticed a faint scar on his hand. "How'd you get that?" she asked, brushing her fingers over it. Adrian glanced at his hand, his expression unreadable. "A long time ago, from someone who thought they could control me." Ivy frowned. "Did they?" Adrian smirked. "Not for long." Her chest tightened at the weight of his words. "You don't have to fight alone, you know." Adrian looked at her, his gaze softer than she'd ever seen it. "Maybe not anymore." That night, as the rain pattered against the windows, their connection deepened. What started as a gentle kiss turned into something more, a slow, deliberate exploration of each other's vulnerabilities. Adrian's hands were no longer just commanding, they were reverent, as if he was afraid she might slip away. Ivy matched his intensity, her own walls crumbling as she let herself feel everything. His passion, his pain, his love. "You're not what I expected," Adrian murmured against her skin, his voice raw. "Neither are you," Ivy whispered back, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. For the first time, their connection felt less like a battle and more like a promise. The peace didn't last long. The next morning, Evelyn burst into the penthouse, her usual composure replaced by urgency. "We have a problem," she said, handing Adrian a tablet. Adrian's face darkened as he scanned the screen. "It's Alexander." "What's going on?" Ivy asked, stepping closer. Adrian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he handed the tablet to her. The screen displayed a news article with a headline that made her stomach drop. "Scandal rocks Vale Industries. Anonymous sources leak damning documents." "He's trying to dismantle everything I've built," Adrian said, his voice calm but laced with fury. "And he's using you to do it." "Me?" Ivy's heart pounded. Alexander thinks you're my weakness, Adrian said, turning to her. That evening, Adrian stood on the penthouse balcony, staring at the city lights. Ivy joined him, wrapping her arms around herself against the cool breeze. "You don't have to protect me," she said softly. Adrian turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Yes, I do." Ivy stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "You're not invincible, Adrian. You don't have to do this alone." Adrian cupped her face, his thumb brushing against her cheek. "You have no idea what you mean to me, Ivy," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I'll destroy anyone who tries to take you from me." Ivy's breath hitched as she stared into his eyes, realizing for the first time just how far Adrian was willing to go, not just for his empire, but for her. Chapter 21. Adrian's phone had been buzzing non-stop all morning. Ivy watched from the kitchen as he paced the living room, his sharp voice cutting through the air as he barked orders into the phone. "This is unacceptable," he growled. "I want every trace of that leak contained. Now." Ivy sipped her coffee, trying to ignore the knot of unease growing in her stomach. She'd seen Adrian handle pressure before, but this was different. His usually calm demeanor was fraying at the edges. "Another day in paradise," she muttered to herself, placing her mug in the sink. Adrian ended the call and immediately dialed another number, not sparing her a glance. Ivy sighed and slipped out of the room. By midday, the tension in the penthouse was unbearable. Evelyn had come and gone 3 times, each visit more urgent than the last. Ivy caught snippets of their conversations, mentions of a syndicate, financial sabotage, and Alexander's name cropping up more than once. Ivy tried to distract herself, reading, cleaning, even attempting to meditate. But the weight of Adrian's unraveling world was impossible to escape. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She found Adrian in his office, surrounded by screens filled with graphs, emails, and news articles. "Adrian," she said softly, stepping inside. He didn't look up. "Not now, Ivy." "You've been saying that all day," she said, crossing her arms. Adrian pinched the bridge of his nose, his exhaustion evident. "I'm dealing with something serious. I know," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "But I'm here too, remember?" He looked at her then, his blue eyes dark with stress. For a moment, she thought he might say something, but he just shook his head and turned back to his screens. Feeling brushed aside, Ivy decided to clear her head and went for a walk. She hadn't gone far when she spotted a familiar figure leaning casually against a lamppost. "Fancy seeing you here," Alexander said, his smirk as sharp as ever. Ivy stopped in her tracks, her heart sinking. "What do you want?" "Just a chat," he said, holding up his hands innocently. "No harm in that, is there?" "I don't have time for your games," she said, trying to walk past him. Alexander stepped into her path, his smirk fading into something colder. "You should make time, Ivy. You might find it enlightening." "What are you talking about?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. "Adrian," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You think you know him, but you don't. Do you even realize what kind of deals he's made to keep that shiny empire of his afloat?" Ivy's chest tightened. "Stop it." "Think about it," Alexander pressed. "Do you really believe you're anything more than a pawn in his game? He'll do whatever it takes to win, Ivy, even if it means sacrificing you." She shook her head, trying to block out his words. "You're lying." "Am I?" Alexander said, his smirk returning. "Ask him. See what he says." Without waiting for a response, he walked away, leaving Ivy standing there, her mind racing. When Ivy returned to the penthouse, it was dark and eerily quiet. Adrian was still out, and the emptiness felt heavier than usual. She curled up on the couch, staring at her phone, debating whether to call him. "Do you really believe you're anything more than a pawn in his game?" Alexander's words echoed in her mind, planting doubts she couldn't shake. She hated that he'd gotten to her, but Adrian's distant behavior wasn't helping. It was past midnight when the front door finally opened. Adrian stepped inside, his suit rumpled and his tie loosened. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in a single day. "Ivy," he said, his voice hoarse. She sat up, her worry outweighing her frustration. "Are you okay?" Instead of answering, Adrian crossed the room in a few long strides and pulled her into his arms. His grip was firm, almost desperate, and she could feel the tension radiating off him. "You're the only thing keeping me sane," he whispered, his voice breaking just enough to make her chest ache. Ivy held him close, torn between the comfort of his touch and the storm of questions swirling in her mind. She didn't know what was worse, the idea that Alexander might be right, or the thought that Adrian was carrying a weight she could never fully understand. Chapter 22. The charity gala was an elegant affair, with chandeliers casting golden light over a sea of perfectly dressed guests. Ivy stood beside Adrian, her emerald gown making her feel like she belonged in his world, if only for the night. Adrian's hand rested lightly on her lower back, his touch grounding her as they mingled with the elite. But despite the glamour, Ivy could feel the tension radiating off him. "Is everything okay?" she whispered. His jaw tightened. "It will be." That's when she saw him. Alexander Cross, leaning casually against the bar, his smirk as sharp as ever. The air seemed to shift as Adrian's gaze locked onto his rival. "Stay here," Adrian said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Adrian, don't," Ivy started, but he was already striding across the room. The crowd seemed to part for Adrian, his commanding presence impossible to ignore. He stopped in front of Alexander, who looked up from his drink with an infuriatingly calm expression. "Adrian," Alexander said, his tone mockingly pleasant. "What a surprise." "This ends now," Adrian said, his voice low and controlled. Alexander chuckled, setting his glass down. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "You've crossed a line," Adrian said, taking a step closer, "and you know it." The tension between them crackled, drawing the attention of nearby guests. Alexander's smirk widened, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "Oh, Adrian," he said, his voice dripping with faux pity, "always so quick to protect your precious empire. But tell me, does Ivy know what it cost you to build?" Adrian's eyes darkened, but before he could respond, Alexander turned his attention to Ivy, who was now watching from across the room. "Has he told you about the deals he made?" Alexander called out, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd. "The people he destroyed to get where he is?" Ivy's stomach churned as murmurs rippled through the room. Adrian stepped in front of Alexander, his voice a low growl. "That's enough." Alexander raised his hands in mock surrender. "Just trying to enlighten her." Adrian grabbed Alexander by the collar, his calm facade cracking. "If you ever come near her again—" "Adrian?" Ivy's voice cut through the chaos, pulling him back. Adrian released Alexander with a shove, his chest heaving as he glared at his rival. Alexander adjusted his collar, unfazed. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," he said, his smirk firmly in place as he disappeared into the crowd. The ride back to the penthouse was silent, the air between them thick with tension. Ivy stared out the window, her mind racing with Alexander's words. When they arrived, Adrian poured himself a drink, his movements sharp and deliberate. Ivy stood by the window, her arms crossed. "Are you going to explain what that was about?" she asked, breaking the silence. Adrian's grip on the glass tightened. "Alexandra thrives on chaos. Don't let him get to you." "That's not an answer," Ivy said, her frustration bubbling over. "What did he mean about the deals you made, about the people you destroyed?" Adrian's eyes snapped to hers, a flicker of something dangerous in them. "It's none of your concern." "It is if I'm part of this world," she shot back. "You keep telling me to trust you, but how can I when you keep shutting me out?" Adrian slammed the glass onto the counter, the sound making Ivy jump. "You don't understand what it takes to survive in my world. Then help me understand," she shouted, stepping closer. His jaw tightened, his hands clenching at his sides. "You think it's that simple, that I can just tell you everything and make it better?" "Yes," Ivy said, her voice cracking. "Because right now I feel like I'm drowning, Adrian, and you're the one holding my head underwater." Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. For a moment, Adrian's expression softened, but the tension between them didn't break. Adrian closed the distance between them in a single step, his hand tangling in her hair as his lips crashed against hers. The kiss was fierce, angry, and desperate, blending their frustration with an undeniable pull neither of them could resist. Ivy pushed against his chest, but her resistance melted as his arms tightened around her. Her fingers gripped his shirt, pulling him closer as their emotions collided in a whirlwind of heat and longing. When they finally broke apart, their breaths came in ragged gasps. Adrian rested his forehead against hers, his hands framing her face. "You don't have to trust me," he said, his voice low and raw. "Just stay." Ivy stared into his eyes, her heart pounding as she realized the truth. She wasn't sure if she could walk away, even if she wanted to. The stakes had never been higher, and as Ivy stood there, her walls crumbling under Adrian's intensity, she knew their story was far from over. Chapter 23. Ivy stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, her fingers gripping the edge of the sink. Dark circles rimmed her eyes, and her usually steady hands trembled. What am I even doing here? Adrian's world was consuming her, pulling her deeper into something she barely understood. And the worst part? She couldn't decide if it was worth it. With a deep breath, she splashed cold water on her face and stepped out into the penthouse's vast, echoing hallways. Adrian was in his office, Evelyn beside him, their voices muffled behind the heavy door. Ivy froze mid-step, catching a few words through the crack in the door. "Are you sure about this?" Evelyn's voice was calm but carried an edge of concern. "It's the only option," Adrian replied, his tone colder than Ivy had ever heard. "This deal could destroy everything if it goes wrong." "It won't," Adrian said firmly. "I won't let it." Ivy's chest tightened. She moved away quickly, her heart pounding. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Ivy couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, terribly wrong. Adrian hadn't mentioned any new deals to her, which wasn't surprising, but it still hurt. By evening, she found herself sitting on the couch, flipping through a book she wasn't really reading. Adrian entered the room, his presence as commanding as ever. "You've been quiet today," he said, his tone neutral. "Just thinking," Ivy replied, not looking up. Adrian frowned, taking a seat across from her. "About?" Ivy hesitated, debating whether to confront him about what she'd overheard. But something in his expression stopped her, the tension in his jaw, the weariness in his eyes. "Nothing important," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian's frown deepened. "If something's bothering you, tell me, like you tell me everything." Ivy shot back before she could stop herself. Adrian's eyes darkened. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Forget it," Ivy said, standing abruptly. "Ivy," Adrian said, his tone a warning. She turned to face him, her frustration boiling over. "I don't know how to do this, Adrian. I don't know how to keep being part of your world when you keep shutting me out." Adrian stood, his towering presence suddenly overwhelming. "You think this is easy for me?" he said, his voice sharp. "You think I don't want to tell you everything?" "Then why don't you?" Ivy asked, her voice cracking. "Why can't you just trust me?" "Because trusting people gets you hurt," Adrian snapped. "It gets you killed, and I can't afford to lose you." His words hung in the air, heavy and raw. For a moment, Ivy's anger wavered, but then Adrian's expression hardened again. "I brought you here to protect you," he continued, "not to explain myself every time you get nervous." "Protect me?" Ivy repeated, her voice rising. "You're not protecting me, Adrian. You're controlling me." Adrian's jaw tightened. "If that's how you see it, maybe you're not as ready for this as I thought." The silence that followed was deafening. Ivy turned and walked out of the room, her heart hammering in her chest. She retreated to the library, the one place in the penthouse that felt remotely like hers. Tears blurred her vision as she sank into a chair, her head in her hands. "I can't keep doing this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own sobs. As Ivy sat there, alone in the dim light of the library, she realized she was standing at a crossroads, and for the first time, she wasn't sure which path to take. Chapter 24. Adrian found Ivy in the library the next morning, curled up in one of the oversized chairs with a book she wasn't reading. Her red-rimmed eyes told him she hadn't slept much, and guilt pricked at him in a way he wasn't used to. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically soft. Ivy glanced up, her expression wary. "What is it, Adrian?" He hesitated, unbuttoning the cuffs of his sleeves. A rare gesture of vulnerability. "I was wrong. About last night. About a lot of things." Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't respond. "I know I've kept you at arm's length," he continued, stepping closer. "It's not because I don't trust you. It's because trust hasn't worked out well for me in the past." "Adrian," Ivy began, her voice softer now. He raised a hand to stop her. "Let me finish. You're right. I can't keep shutting you out. So, if you're willing, I'd like you to join me in figuring out how to deal with Alexander. You deserve to know what's going on." Ivy blinked, caught off guard. "Are you serious?" "Completely," he said, his blue eyes steady on hers. Adrian led Ivy to a room she hadn't seen before, a sleek, high-tech space that looked like something out of a spy movie. Screens covered one wall, displaying maps, documents, and images Ivy didn't recognize. A large table dominated the center, scattered with papers and files. Evelyn was already there, tablet in hand, her eyebrows raising slightly when she saw Ivy. "New recruit?" she asked dryly. "Something like that," Adrian replied, pulling out a chair for Ivy. Ivy sat down, feeling out of place but determined not to show it. Adrian gestured to one of the screens. "Alexander's been leaking sensitive information to a syndicate we've had dealings with in the past. If he keeps this up, they'll either try to dismantle my empire or take it for themselves." Ivy frowned, studying the information. "What do they want?" "Power," Adrian said simply. "And money, of course. Alexander's giving them just enough leverage to make a move." "So, cut off their leverage," Ivy said, tapping the edge of the table. Adrian raised an eyebrow. "And how would you suggest we do that?" "Well," Ivy said, her confidence growing slightly, "if they're relying on the information Alexander is feeding them, why not feed them false information? Something that looks real enough to trust but leads them into a trap." Evelyn looked up from her tablet, her expression impressed. "That's actually a solid idea." Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying Ivy with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "It could work," he said slowly. "Evelyn, start drafting a plan. We'll need it airtight." Evelyn nodded, already typing away. As the discussion continued, Ivy found herself contributing more than she expected. She pointed out gaps in their current strategy, asked questions that sparked new ideas, and even suggested ways to manipulate Alexander's next move. By the end of the meeting, Adrian's inner circle was glancing at her with something that almost resembled respect. "Not bad," she said. Ivy couldn't help but smile, a sense of pride blooming in her chest. For the first time, she felt like she was more than just a pawn in Adrian's game. Adrian stayed behind, watching as Ivy left the room. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Pride, maybe, or something deeper. "She's stronger than I thought," he said to Evelyn, his voice thoughtful. "She might even survive this." Evelyn glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Let's hope so." Adrian turned back to the screens, his jaw tightening. The battle against Alexander was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he wasn't fighting it alone. Chapter 25. Ivy stared at Adrian, her mouth slightly open. "You want me to go to the meeting? Alone?" Adrian nodded, his expression calm but serious. "Yes. You've seen how these meetings work. You'll represent me." "Adrian," Evelyn cut in, her tone incredulous. "Are you sure about this? These people are sharks. She's ready," Adrian interrupted, his tone firm. Ivy looked between them, her stomach twisted. "But if I screw up?" "You won't," Adrian said, stepping closer. "You're smarter than you think, Ivy. You'll do fine. Just remember, confidence is everything, and don't let them intimidate you." Adrian handed Ivy a sleek black folder containing all the details she'd need for the meeting. He'd also arranged for Evelyn to brief her on the key players she'd face. "You'll want to watch out for Dorian Russo," Evelyn said as they sat in the office. "He's charming, but he'll try to trip you up. And then there's Marissa Kane. She'll smile to your face while stabbing you in the back." "Great," Ivy muttered, flipping through the notes. Anything else? Do I need to pack shark repellent? Evelyn smirked. You'll be fine. Just stay sharp. Later, Adrian presented Ivy with the outfit he'd chosen for her, a fitted navy dress that exuded sophistication without being over the top. Is this really necessary? Ivy asked, holding the dress up. Yes, Adrian said simply. First impressions matter. Ivy sighed but decided not to argue. The venue was intimidating, a sleek high-rise with a conference room that could easily double as a movie set for high-powered business drama. Ivy's heels clicked on the polished floor as she entered, her nerves twisting tighter with every step. The room fell silent when she walked in. All eyes turned to her, some curious, others openly skeptical. Good evening, she said, forcing her voice to stay steady as she took her seat at the table. Dorian Russo leaned back in his chair, a smug smile playing on his lips. Well, this is a surprise. Where's Adrian? He trusted me to handle this, Ivy said smoothly, meeting his gaze without flinching. Marissa Kane raised an eyebrow. Bold move. Let's see if it pays off. The discussion began, and Ivy quickly realized she was in for a challenge. Every comment she made was met with probing questions and subtle jabs, but she refused to let them rattle her. When Dorian tried to poke holes in Adrian's proposal, Ivy countered with logic and poise. When Marissa attempted to undermine her, Ivy deflected with a calm smile and an answer that left no room for doubt. By the end of the meeting, the room was buzzing with murmurs, and Ivy walked out, feeling like she'd just climbed a mountain. When Ivy returned to the penthouse, Adrian was waiting for her. He stood as she walked in, his eyes scanning her as if trying to gauge how she'd fared. Well, he asked, his voice unreadable. I think I survived, Ivy said, her lips curving into a small smile. Adrian's expression softened, and for a moment, something like pride flickered in his eyes. He crossed the room, stopping just in front of her. You were perfect tonight, he said, his voice low and warm. Ivy blinked, caught off guard by the rare compliment. Really? Adrian nodded, his hands gently gripping her arms. I couldn't be prouder. Before she could respond, Adrian pulled her into a private embrace, his hold firm but tender. Ivy closed her eyes, letting herself sink into the moment, her doubts momentarily silenced by the warmth of his touch. Chapter 26. The day started like any other, calm, controlled, with Adrian meticulously orchestrating his world as he always did. But by late afternoon, the cracks began to show. Ivy had just settled into the library when Evelyn stormed into the penthouse, her usually composed expression replaced with something Ivy could only describe as panic. Adrian! Evelyn called out, her voice sharp. Adrian appeared from his office, his calm demeanor faltering as he took in her expression. What happened? Evelyn handed him a tablet. Alexander, he's pulled the trigger on the takeover. Adrian's face darkened as he scanned the screen, his grip tightening until Ivy thought he might snap the device in half. Ivy watched from the doorway as Adrian paced the room, barking orders into his phone. Words like hostile takeover and irreparable loss flew through the air, each one landing like a blow. What does this mean? Ivy asked Evelyn quietly. It means Alexander just crippled one of Adrian's key businesses, Evelyn said grimly. And it's going to take a miracle to recover. Ivy's stomach churned. She'd seen Adrian angry before, but this was different. This was desperation, raw and unfiltered. By the time the calls ended, Adrian was a storm, barely contained. He stood by the window, his fists clenched and his jaw tight. Ivy approached cautiously, her heart pounding. Adrian, she said softly, are you okay? Do I look okay? He snapped, his voice cutting through the room like a whip. Ivy flinched but didn't back away. I just meant, you don't get it, Ivy. Adrian interrupted, turning to face her. Everything I've worked for, everything I've built, is crumbling because of him. I do get it, she said, her voice trembling. But you don't have to go through this alone. Adrian let out a bitter laugh. Alone? That's exactly what I have to be, because trusting anyone only leads to betrayal. His words hit Ivy like a punch to the gut. That's not fair, she said, her voice cracking. I'm here. I've been here. Adrian's eyes flashed with something between anger and pain. Maybe you shouldn't be. Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Ivy stared at him, her heart breaking as his words echoed in her mind. You don't mean that, she whispered. Adrian ran a hand through his hair, his frustration spilling over. I don't know what I mean anymore. Without another word, he grabbed his coat and stormed out, the door slamming behind him. Ivy sank onto the couch, tears streaming down her face as the weight of everything crashed over her. For the first time, she wondered if she'd made a mistake by staying, by believing Adrian could let her in. As the city lights flickered outside the window, Ivy wiped her tears and whispered into the empty room. What am I even doing here? Chapter 27. Ivy hadn't seen Adrian since he stormed out, leaving the penthouse in tense silence. She wandered through the rooms, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and hurt. When the doorbell rang, she hesitated. Adrian never used the bell, and Evelyn usually called before visiting. Still, she approached the door cautiously and peeked through the peephole. It was a delivery man holding a box. She cracked the door open, forcing a smile. Can I help you? Before she could react, the man shoved the door wide and two masked figures rushed in. Wait, what are you? Ivy's scream was cut short as a cloth was pressed over her mouth. The world tilted and everything went black. When Ivy woke, her head throbbed and her wrists burned from the ropes binding her hands. She was in a dimly lit room, the air heavy with damp wood and oil scent. Good, you're awake. She turned her head sharply, wincing at the movement. Alexander leaned casually against the wall, his ever-present smirk firmly in place. What? What do you want? She asked, her voice hoarse. Nothing from you, darling, Alexander said, crouching in front of her. But Adrian, he's about to lose everything. Her stomach twisted. Why are you doing this? Because I can, he said simply, and because Adrian needs a reminder that his actions have consequences. You, my dear, are leverage. Ivy glared at him, refusing to let him see her fear. He won't let you win. Alexander laughed. We'll see. Hours passed before Adrian's voice shattered the silence. Let her go, Alexandra. Adrian strode into the room, his usual composure cracking just enough to reveal the storm beneath. His eyes found Ivy immediately, and she could see the fury and fear warring within him. Adrian, Alexander said, spreading his arms wide. Glad you could join us, Adrian. Adrian ignored him, his focus solely on Ivy. Are you hurt? I'm fine, she said, though her voice wavered. Touching? Alexander said, rolling his eyes. Now, let's get to the point. You know what I want. Alexander's jaw clenched. And if I refuse? Alexander's smirk widened. Then she pays the price. Adrian's fists tightened at his sides, his mind racing. He couldn't lose Ivy. Not her, not after everything. Fine, he said finally, his voice cold. You'll get what you want. Smart choice, Alexander said, nodding to his men. They cut Ivy's bindings and she stumbled forward, her legs weak. Adrian was there in an instant, steadying her with firm hands. You're okay, he murmured, his voice low and soothing. Alexander chuckled. Enjoy what's left of your empire, Adrian. It won't last long. Adrian's glare could have frozen fire. You've made your move. Don't push me further. Back in the penthouse, Ivy collapsed onto the couch, her body shaking as the adrenaline wore off. Adrian sat beside her, pulling her into his arms. I'm so sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. I should have protected you. You couldn't have known, she said, her voice muffled against his chest. Adrian's grip tightened. You're the only thing that matters, Ivy. I can't lose you. As Ivy clung to him, she realized that despite everything, Adrian had sacrificed part of his world for her, but at what cost? And what would come next? Chapter 28. The days after her kidnapping blurred together. Adrian hovered close, his protectiveness dialed up to an intensity that left Ivy both comforted and suffocated. But even as her physical wounds healed, a gnawing unease lingered. Something didn't add up. Adrian was too controlled, too strategic to be blindsided by someone like Alexander. and the more Ivy thought about it, the more questions she had. It was late one evening when her curiosity got the better of her. Adrian had stepped out to take a call, and Ivy found herself alone in his study, a room she rarely entered. The space was as immaculate as Adrian himself, every book and paper perfectly aligned. Ivy trailed her fingers along the edge of the desk, her eyes catching on a small stack of files. One folder, partially hidden beneath the others, bore her name. Her heart pounded as she pulled it free. Inside were pages of information, details about her life that Adrian couldn't have known unless he'd been digging. Her heart sank as she read through the file. Her debts, Noah's medical condition, the eviction notice. Everything that had pushed her toward Club Vesper was there, meticulously documented. But one detail stopped her cold. A note scrawled in the margin of a financial document. Ensure she receives the invitation. Ivy's breath caught. Adrian hadn't just found her by chance. He'd orchestrated everything. When Adrian returned, Ivy was waiting for him, the file clutched in her trembling hands. "What is this?" she demanded, holding it up. Adrian's expression darkened as he closed the door behind him. "Ivy, let me explain. You knew," she said, her voice shaking. "You knew about my situation before the auction. You planned for me to end up there, didn't you?" Adrian took a step toward her, his gaze steady but unreadable. "I did." The admission hit her like a punch to the stomach. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do that?" "Because I couldn't stay away," Adrian said, his voice low but fierce. "I saw your file months before the auction. Your resilience, your determination, it captivated me. I wanted you in my world, Ivy." Her anger flared. "So you manipulated me, pushed me towards selling myself." "I didn't push you," Adrian said, his voice rising slightly. "I gave you an opportunity, and yes, I made sure you ended up at the auction because it was the only way I could have you." Ivy stared at him, her chest heaving as she tried to process his words. "You had no right." Adrian stepped closer, his expression softening. "You're right, but I don't regret it, not for a second." "How can you say that?" she asked, tears welling in her eyes. "Because what I feel for you isn't a game," Adrian said, his voice breaking. "At first, it was obsession, yes, but it's more than that now. You mean more to me than anything, Ivy." Her hands tightened around the file. "And you think that excuses what you did?" "No," Adrian said, his gaze unwavering, "but I won't apologize for wanting you." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Ivy's emotions warred within her, anger, betrayal, and an undeniable pull she couldn't explain. "You had no right," she said again, her voice trembling. "You took away my choice." Adrian reached for her, his touch gentle but firm. "I did it because I couldn't lose you, and I'd do it again if it meant keeping you in my life." Ivy stared at him, her heart torn between fury and the dangerous desire his words ignited. As his hand cupped her face, Adrian whispered, "I did it because I couldn't stay away. I won't apologize for wanting you." Chapter 29. Ivy stood in her room, the open suitcase on the bed mocking her. She had thrown in a few clothes, her favorite book, and the framed picture of her and Noah she always kept on the nightstand. But packing wasn't the hard part. The hard part was leaving. Adrian's confession echoed in her mind, his voice raw with emotion. "I did it because I couldn't stay away. I won't apologize for wanting you." How could she stay after everything she'd learned? He had manipulated her life, stolen her agency, and yet there was no denying the part of her that wanted to believe he truly cared. Ivy zipped up the suitcase, her hands trembling. Adrian was waiting for her in the living room, his posture tense as he paced the floor. The moment he saw her with the suitcase, his face darkened. "You're leaving," he said, his voice low but strained. "I don't see what choice I have," Ivy replied, gripping the handle tightly. Adrian's eyes softened, a flicker of desperation breaking through his usual composure. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," she said, her voice cracking. "You lied to me, Adrian. You controlled my life without giving me a say. How am I supposed to trust you after that?" Adrian took a deep breath, his hands clenching at his sides. I know I've made mistakes. I know I've hurt you. But please, let me explain, really explain before you go." Ivy didn't respond, but she didn't leave either. Taking that as permission, Adrian sat down on the edge of the couch, his elbows resting on his knees. "When I was a kid," he began, his voice quieter now, "I watched my mother get torn apart by people who wanted to control her." Ivy blinked, surprised by the sudden vulnerability in his tone. "She worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat after my father left," Adrian continued, his gaze distant. "And when she couldn't pay off a debt she owed, the people she trusted turned on her. I was 10 years old, watching her beg for mercy from men who didn't care if she lived or died." "Adrian," Ivy whispered, her chest tightening. "That's why I built my empire," Adrian said, his voice hardening, "so I'd never be powerless again. So I'd never have to watch someone I care about suffer like that." He looked up at her, his blue eyes burning with intensity. "I saw you, Ivy. I saw how strong you were, but I also saw the weight you were carrying. I thought if I brought you into my world, I could protect you, give you a life where you didn't have to fight so hard." "But you didn't ask me," Ivy said, her voice trembling. "You just decided for me." "I know," Adrian admitted, his voice breaking, "and I regret that more than you'll ever know. But what I feel for you, Ivy, it's real. It's messy and complicated and flawed, but it's real." Silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Ivy's grip on the suitcase tightened as she tried to process everything. "I can't promise I'll be perfect," Adrian said, standing. "But I can promise that I'll never lie to you again. If you need to leave, I won't stop you. But if you stay," he paused, his voice softening. "If you stay, I'll spend every day proving that you can trust me." Tears pricked Ivy's eyes as she turned toward the door. Her hand hovered over the handle, her heart pulling her in 2 directions. Standing at the doorway with her bag in hand, Ivy hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Behind her, Adrian waited, his breath held, as the silence stretched between them. Chapter 30. Ivy sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her packed suitcase. The sound of the city buzzed faintly outside, but inside the penthouse it was eerily quiet. Her heart and mind were locked in a tug of war, the weight of Adrian's confession still pressing down on her. A knock at the door startled her. "Ivy," Evelyn said as she stepped into the room, her usual brisk demeanor softened. "Have a minute?" Ivy nodded, wiping her eyes quickly. "If you're here to convince me to stay, I don't think it'll work." Evelyn crossed her arms, leaning casually against the door frame. "I'm not here to convince you of anything, but before you decide, I think you should hear something." Ivy frowned. "What is it?" Evelyn hesitated, her gaze dropping for a moment. "I've worked for Adrian for a long time. I've seen the best and worst of him. And I know better than most why he is the way he is." Evelyn took a seat in the armchair by the window, her posture unusually relaxed. "Years ago, before he built all of this, Adrian helped me out of a situation I couldn't escape from. My family was in trouble and no one else would take the risk to help me. But Adrian did." Ivy tilted her head. "Why would he do that?" "Because he saw something in me," Evelyn said with a small smile. "The same way he sees something in you." "That doesn't excuse what he did," Ivy said, her voice firm. "No, it doesn't," Evelyn agreed. "But you need to understand something about Adrian. Everything he does, every choice he makes, is because he's terrified of losing the people he cares about. He doesn't always get it right, but his intentions aren't as cold as they seem." Ivy looked down at her hands, her thoughts swirling. "He still lied to me. He took away my choices. And he's paying for that now," Evelyn said gently. "But if you leave, he'll lose the one thing that's kept him grounded since the moment he met you." Evelyn stood, smoothing the front of her blazer. "Whatever you decide, make sure it's for you. Not because of what he's done or hasn't done, but I'll say this. Adrian Vale isn't a man who gives his heart lightly, and he's given it to you." As Evelyn left the room, Ivy sat in silence, her mind replaying everything she'd learned. Adrian's actions were flawed, there was no denying that, but beneath his control and obsession was a man who loved deeply, even if he didn't know how to show it the right way. For the first time, Ivy felt a flicker of understanding. With a deep breath, Ivy stood and walked to the suitcase. Her hand rested on the zipper for a moment before she stepped back and left the room. She found Adrian in his study, standing by the window with his back to her. The tension in his shoulders was palpable, but he didn't turn when she entered. "I thought you'd be gone by now," he said quietly. "I almost was," Ivy replied, her voice steady. Adrian finally turned, his blue eyes heavy with emotion. "And now?" Ivy took a deep breath, meeting his gaze. "I'm staying." Relief flashed across his face, but she raised a hand to stop him from speaking. "If we're doing this," she continued, her voice firm, "it's on my terms too. No more lies, no more decisions without me. We face everything together or not at all." Adrian nodded slowly, his expression softening. "Together, then." Ivy stepped closer, her resolve unshaken. For the first time, she felt like she was standing on equal ground with Adrian, ready to face whatever came next.